In ancient Egypt, rulers built monuments so their names would live forever. Their temples rose above the Nile. Their achievements were carved into stone. Their images were meant to survive for eternity. But what happens when someone tries to erase a ruler from that record entirely? Today's story is about a pharaoh whose statues were smashed, whose name was chiseled for monuments, and whose reign was nearly lost to history. And yet, thousands of years later, her story returned. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Simply Suspicious, the podcast where we look at the strange, complicated corners of history and occasionally discover that the official version of events is not quite as straightforward as it first appears. Today's episode takes us back roughly 3,500 years to ancient Egypt during the early New Kingdom. It was a period of expansion, wealth, and monumental architecture when Egyptian rulers projected their power through massive temples and carefully crafted inscriptions intended to preserve their names for eternity. The Egyptians believed that as long as a person's name continued to be spoken or written, their legacy endured. To be erased from the historical record was therefore not simply an inconvenience, it was a profound loss of memory and identity. Which makes today's story particularly intriguing because the ruler at its center appears to have been deliberately removed from that record. For many centuries, historians knew almost nothing about the reign of Hatshepsut, despite the fact that she governed Egypt for nearly 2 decades and oversaw one of the most prosperous and architecturally ambitious periods of the dynasty. Only later, when archaeologists began examining damaged monuments and partially erased inscriptions, did it become clear that an entire chapter of Egyptian political history had been systematically altered. Hatshepsut was born around 1507 BCE during the reign of her father, Thutmose I, a ruler known for expanding Egyptian power into Nubia and parts of the Near East. Growing up in the royal court meant that Hatshepsut was immersed in the ceremonial and religious structures that defined Egyptian kinship. Pharaohs were not simply political leaders, they were believed to serve as intermediaries between the gods and the human world, responsible for maintaining cosmic balance, or ma'at. The authority of the throne therefore rested on both political and religious legitimacy. Within that system, however, there was an assumption that had remained largely unquestioned. The pharaoh was male. Women in ancient Egypt possessed more legal independence than women in many other ancient societies. They could own property, inherit wealth, and manage estates. Royal women sometimes held influential positions within the temple system or the court, yet the throne itself had almost always been occupied by men, and the imagery surrounding kingship reflected that expectation. Following dynastic custom, Hatshepsut eventually married her half-brother Thutmose II, who inherited the throne after their father's death. Royal sibling marriages were not unusual within Egyptian ruling families as they helped maintain the perceived purity of the royal bloodline and reinforce claims to legitimacy. The arrangement was primarily political rather than personal. Thutmose II's reign appears to have been relatively brief. When he died, the throne passed to his son, Thutmose III. The difficulty was that the new king was still a child. Egypt therefore faced a familial dynastic problem. The legitimate ruler was too young to govern. In situations like this, royal women occasionally acted as regents, overseeing the administration of the kingdom until the young king came of age. Hatshepsut initially assumed precisely that role. For several years, she governed Egypt on behalf of the child pharaoh, while he remained the nominal ruler. At some point during this period, however, the arrangement began to shift. Rather than stepping aside once Thutmose III was old enough to assume authority, she gradually adopted the full titles and imagery associated with kingship. In official inscriptions, she was described as pharaoh, and temple reliefs began depicting her wearing the regalia traditionally associated with male rulers, including the ceremonial false beard of Egyptian kings. Artists also began portraying her body using the stylized proportions commonly reserved for male figures in Egyptian royal art. These changes were not necessarily intended to conceal her identity as a woman. Instead, they appear to have allowed her to operate within the established visual and symbolic language of Egyptian kinship. By adopting the traditional imagery of the pharaoh, she could present her authority in a way that fit comfortably within existing religious and political expectations. For approximately 20 years, Egypt remained stable under Hatshepsut's rule. Unlike some of her predecessors, she did not focus primarily on military expansion. Instead, her reign emphasized monumental architecture, religious patronage, and international trade. One of the most remarkable projects associated with her rule is her mortuary temple at Deir al-Bahiri, located near modern Luxor along with the western bank of the Nile. Built into the cliffs overlooking the valley, the temple arises in a series of terraced colonnades that blend almost seamlessly with the surrounding landscape. Even today, it remains one of the most distinctive and elegant architectural sites in Egypt. Hatshepsut also organized an ambitious trading expedition to the region known as Land of Punt, which many scholars believe was located somewhere along the Red Sea coast of East Africa. Reliefs carved into the walls of her temple depict Egyptian ships returning with gold, ebony, ivory, exotic animals, and living incense trees that were transplanted in temple gardens back in Egypt. The expedition illustrates the economic priorities of her reign and demonstrates that Egypt remained well connected to distant trading networks. Throughout this period, the young king Thutmose III continued to hold the formal title of Pharaoh alongside Hatshepsut. Inscriptions often list them as co-rulers, although the surviving evidence suggests that Hatshepsut exercised the primary authority during these years. Thutmose III spent much of his youth within military establishment, receiving training that would eventually shape his own reign. When he later ruled independently, he became one of the most formidable military leaders in Egyptian history, leading campaigns that expanded Egypt's empire across Syria and the Levant. Because of his extensive military successes, some historians have compared him, somewhat dramatically, to Napoleon. Interestingly, the available evidence suggests the relationship between Hatshepsut and Thutmose III remained politically stable during her lifetime. There is little indication of open conflict between them, despite the unusual nature of their arrangement. After Hatshepsut died around 1458 BCE, Thutmose III continued ruling Egypt without any immediate effort to erase her memory. The systematic destruction of her images appears to have begun only later in his reign, roughly 2 decades after her death. At the point statues of Hatshepsut were smashed, her names were chiseled from inscriptions, and reliefs depicting her rule were altered or removed. In some cases, monuments were modified so that it appeared as though she had never ruled at all. For many years, historians assumed that Thutmose III ordered these actions as an act of personal revenge. However, the delayed timing suggests a more complicated explanation. By the later years of his reign, questions of succession and dynastic legitimacy may have become increasingly important. Because Egyptian kingship had traditionally been male, the existence of a female pharaoh complicated the official narrative of the royal lineage. Removing Hatshepsut from the monuments may therefore have been an attempt to simplify the dynastic record and present a more conventional line of succession. One might say that it was a form of ancient political editing, an effort to tidy up the historical narrative. Despite those efforts, the attempt was not entirely successful, obviously. Fragments of statues survived, inscriptions were only partially erased, and the architectural projects of her reign remained visible across the landscape. Even so, one mystery persisted for centuries. No one knew where her body had been buried. Her tomb had been identified in the Valley of the Kings, yet her mummy appeared to be missing. In the early 20th century, archaeologists discovered 2 unidentified female mummies in a nearby tomb. One lay inside a coffin belonging to Hatshepsut's nurse, while the other lay on the floor without identification. For decades, historians could only speculate about the identity of that second woman. Then, in 2007, Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass announced a discovery that provided a possible answer. Among the artifacts associated with Hatshepsut's burial was a small wooden box inscribed with her name. Inside the box was a single human tooth. CT scans of the unidentified mummy revealed a missing tooth socket that matched the tooth almost perfectly. While not absolutely conclusive, the evidence strongly suggested that the unidentified body was, in fact, Hatshepsut herself. After thousands of years of uncertainty, the ruler whose memory had once been deliberately obscured had been rediscovered. Today, Hatshepsut is widely recognized as one of the most significant rulers of Egypt's New Kingdom. Her monuments remain among the most impressive in the Nile Valley, and her reign provides a fascinating example of how political authority could be adapted to circumstances that earlier generations had never anticipated. Perhaps most intriguingly, the attempt to erase her from history ultimately failed. The evidence left behind in damaged monuments and forgotten tombs allowed historians to reconstruct her story piece by piece. It is a reminder that while history can be edited, suppressed, or rewritten, it rarely disappears completely. Eventually, the past has a way of resurfacing. Thanks for listening to Simply Suspicious. Please make sure to rate and review and follow us over on IG on simply_suspicious. Bye, y'all.